By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
Chapter 1. The curse of ambition. The rain in Lochdubh didn't so much fall as it did loiter. It was a fine grey smur that clung to the heather and turned the peat bogs into treacherous sucking traps. PC Hamish Macbeth, a tall, lanky man with a shock of unruly red hair and eyes the colour of a Highland loch after a storm, stood on the banks of the river and Dub. He was not strictly speaking on duty. He was, strictly speaking, hoping a particularly plump salmon would forget its natural caution and find its way into his waiting net. "Just one, lugs," Hamish murmured to his dog, a scruffy, large-eared mongrel, who sat with stoic patience at his side. "The larder is looking a bit thin, and there's no sense letting the gentry have all the best catches when they aren't even here to enjoy them." Lugs offered a low, sceptical woof. The dog knew that Hamish's definition of the gentry was broad enough to include anyone with permanent address south of Inverness and a bank balance larger than a postman's pension. Hamish had just managed to manoeuvre his net when the distant, obnoxious drone of a high-performance engine shattered the Highland silence. It was a sound that didn't belong in Sutherland, a sharp, aggressive snarl that spoke of city streets and a complete lack of respect for the local speed limits. Hamish sighed, the salmon forgotten. He pulled his net back and began the slow trek back toward the village, his long strides deceptive in their speed. By the time he reached the main street of Lochdubh, the source of the noise was parked crookedly in front of the Lochdubh Hotel. It was a bright yellow Ferrari, looking like a tropical insect that had lost its way and landed in a puddle of cold porridge. Stepping out of the car was a man who looked equally out of place. He was dressed in a pristine white linen suit entirely inappropriate for the Scotch stand, wore a pair of sunglasses that likely cost more than Hamish's annual salary. "You there, constable," the man shouted, spotting Hamish's uniform. His accent was clipped, southern English, and carried the unmistakable weight of someone used to being obeyed. "Is there someone in this godforsaken outpost who can carry my bags, or do I have to do everything myself?" Hamish stopped, leaning lazily against a stone wall. He took his time adjusting his cap, his expression one of vacant, mild-mannered curiosity. Well, now," Hamish said, his voice a soft, slow drawl. "The boots at the hotel is likely having his tea. It's a sacred time tea." "Yow'll be Mr. Julian Vane, I take it? The one who bought the old Macrae cottage?" The man sneered, his lip curling. "I bought the estate, as you call it. I intend to turn that crumbling pile of Victorian rubbish into a boutique wellness retreat, the Highland Sanctuary. They're looking at this damp little village. The Highland Sump might be more accurate. Is that so?" Hamish replied mildly, though his brown eyes sharpened for a fraction of a second. "The Macrae place has a lot of history. Some say it's best left to the ghosts and the damp. I don't pay for ghosts, constable. I pay for results," Vane snapped. "Now, see to it that no one touches the car. It's worth more than this entire street." He turned on his heel and marched into the hotel, leaving a scent of expensive cologne and arrogance in his wake. Hamish watched him go, then looked down at Lugs. A wellness retreat. Lugs. "I imagine that means people paying a fortune to eat grass and sit in the rain. And he wants me to guard his car." Hamish didn't guard the car. Instead, he headed toward the hotel bar. He had a sudden, pressing need for a cup of coffee and a bit of gossip from Mrs. Emma Grant behind the counter. If there was a storm coming to Lochdubh, it wasn't just the weather, it was the arrival of Julian Vane. And Hamish Macbeth, despite his best efforts to avoid work, knew that men like Vane usually brought trouble in their luggage. Chapter 2. A muddy kind of mindfulness the following morning did not break so much as it bruised. The sky a delicate shade of purple-grey that promised nothing but more dampness. Hamish Macbeth was in his kitchen, the heart of the police station, nursing a mug of coffee that was strong enough to peel paint. He was carefully watching a pot of porridge bubble on the stove, a pinch of salt already added, when the peace of the morning was shattered by the shrill, frantic ringing of the telephone. Hamish looked at the black plastic instrument with profound distaste. It sat on the sideboard like a malevolent toad. He considered, briefly, letting it ring until the caller gave up, but the persistence of the tone suggested an emergency that wouldn't be ignored by a simple lapse in manners. Lochdubh Police Station," Hamish sighed into the receiver. "Hamish, come quick," said Sassenach, the one with the yellow car. It was Jessie, the young maid from the Lochdubh Hotel, her voice hovering on the edge of a scream. "He's at the Macrae place. Oh, Hamish, he's terrible to look at." Hamish felt a cold knot of resignation form in his stomach. "Calm down, Jessie. Is he hurt?" "Hurt?" "He's past hurt, Hamish. He's in the mud." He's gone and turned into a statue of filth. With a heavy groan, Hamish turned off the stove. The porridge would have to wait. And a cold bowl of oats was a miserable start to a day that was clearly going to be dominated by paperwork and the unwelcome presence of the Strathbane CID. He whistled for Lugs, who was already waiting by the door, his tail giving a single mournful thump against the floorboards. The Macrae cottager, the Highland sanctuary, as Julianne Vane had pretentiously renamed it, sat 3 miles out of the village, perched on a crag that overlooked the dark, churning waters of the loch. It was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity, all gables and jagged stonework, currently surrounded by scaffolding and piles of expensive Italian marble that looked utterly defeated by the Scottish mud. Hamish parked his ancient Land Rover and stepped out into the drizzle. Jessie was standing by the open front door, wringing her hands in her apron, her face the colour of skimmed milk. In the conservatory she choked out, pointing a trembling finger. He said he was going to have a primordial soak before breakfast. I went to bring him his green juice, and... Hamish patted her shoulder awkwardly. Stay here, lass. Don't touch a thing. He walked through the house, his boots clicking on the half-finished hardwood floors. The air smelled of fresh plaster, expensive cedarwood, and something else, a metallic, heavy scent that Hamish recognised all too well. The conservatory was a glass-walled room designed to capture the sunlight that Lochdubh so rarely received. In the centre sat a massive antique Victorian clawfoot bathtub that Vane had supposedly salvaged from the ruins. It was filled to the brim with a thick, viscous grey, sludged organic volcanic clay Vane had bragged about. Protruding from the grey muck was Julian Vane. He was positioned face down in the tub, his white silk robe discarded on the floor like a molted skin. Only the back of his head and his stiff, arrogant shoulders were visible above the drying clay. He looked less like a human being and more like a half-finished sculpture abandoned by a madman. A single, perfectly manicured hand gripped the edge of the porcelain tub, the fingernails caked with the very mud he had paid a fortune to import. Hamish knelt by the tub, his eyes narrowing. He didn't touch the body. He noticed the way the clay had splashed onto the floor in a specific pattern, and how a heavy brass towel rail had been wrenched from the wall. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered, the dog sniffing tentatively at the edge of the grey slime. He wanted a Victorian experience. It seems the Highlands have given him one he won't be writing a testimonial for. Hamish stood up, his gaze wandering to the open window. The wind whistled through the gap, bringing with it the scent of wet heather and the distant bleat of a sheep. There were no footprints on the marble floor, but Hamish noticed a small, dark smudge on the white windowsill, a smear of peat that didn't match the grey volcanic clay in the tub. He pulled a crumpled packet of cigarettes from his pocket, then remembered he was at a crime scene and put them away with a sigh. His peaceful day was gone. The salmon would go uncaught, his porridge was cold, and within the hour, the quiet roads of Sutherland would be choked with the self-importance of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. "He's dead as a salt herring, Lugs," Hamish muttered, looking down at the humiliated remains of the man who had yesterday claimed to own the hills. "And the worst of it is, he'll likely have to miss my lunch dealing with the fallout." He walked back to the hall to call it in, his mind already beginning to sift through the villagers. Who hated Vane enough to drown him in his own vanity? In Lochdubh, the list was likely to be a long one. Chapter 3. The arrival of the heavy brigade. The silence of the crag was not merely broken, it was executed. The mournful cry of the curlew was drowned out by the scream of sirens and the frantic crunch of gravel as 2 police sedans and a forensic van careened into the driveway of the Highlands sanctuary. They drove with the aggressive urgency of men who believed that the speed of their arrival was directly proportional to the quality of their detective work. Leading the charge was Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He burst from the lead car like a cork from a shaken bottle of cheap cidered-faced, thick-necked, and already sweating despite the Highland chill. His suit jacket was strained across a belly that had seen far too many deep-fried Mars bars and pints of heavy, and his eyes were small, darting, and perpetually suspicious. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "Why are you standing around like a decorative garden gnome? Get this area cordoned off." "Where's the body? And why haven't you started a log?" Hamish, who was currently leaning against a pillar with his hands deep in his pockets, didn't move. He looked at Blair with a gaze of mild, bovine detachment. "The body's in the conservatory, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its most irritatingly slow Highland lilt, "in the tub. And the log is started, though there's not much to put in it yet, save for the rain and the fact that poor Mr. Vane has stopped breathing." Blair shoved past him, nearly knocking Lugs over. "Out of the way, you useless peasant. Hand keep that flea bag outside." This is a professional operation now. Move, move, move. Hamish watched as Blair's team, including the long-suffering D.S. Anderson and the eager, sycophantic D.C. Macnab, swarmed the house. They brought with them the smell of stale coffee and the frantic energy of the city, an energy that always felt like an allergic reaction to the stillness of Lochdubh. Inside the conservatory, Blair stood over the tub, his face contorting into a mask of disgust. Good God, what a way to go. Drowned in a bucket of cement? It's volcanic clay, sir, Hamish offered from the doorway, where he stood carefully outside the invisible perimeter Blair liked to imagine he maintained. Very expensive. Imported from Italy. I don't care if it came from the moon. Blair snapped. Look at the state of him. It's a clear-cut case of assault. He was forced down into that muck and held there. Look at the bruising on the neck, or what I can see of it through the sludge. Hamish squinted. He hadn't seen any bruising yet, and he doubted Blair could see much through 2 inches of grey silt, but he knew better than to correct the inspector when he was in a visionary mood. And who stands to gain, Macbeth? Blair continued, pacing the marble floor and leaving muddy prints everywhere. The locals. You lot hate outsiders, especially rich ones who come in and try to change things. Who was the last person to see him alive? That would be Jessie, the maid from the hotel, Hamish said. But she only arrived this morning. Before that, well, he was seen arguing with Geordie MC Nab, the contractor, something about the plumbing. Blair's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. Mac Nab, the big fellow with the temper? I remember him. Broke a man's nose in a pub in Laireg 3 years ago. Typical Highland thug. He probably didn't like being told how to lay a pipe and decided to give Mr. Vane a primordial soak he wouldn't forget. Geordie's a hot-headed man, to be sure, Hamish said softly, but he's a craftsman. He wouldn't ruin a perfectly good Victorian bathtub. He's too proud of his work for that. Blair let out a bark of derisive laughter. Listen to you. He's a craftsman. This isn't a poem, Macbeth. It's a murder. Anderson, get over to Macnab's workshop. Bring him in for questioning. I want him in the back of the van before lunch. But sir, Hamish interjected, the window is a window, Macbeth. It's open because it's a conservatory and it gets hot. Now, get out there and direct traffic. Try to look like a policeman instead of a wandering shepherd. And stay away from the forensics team. I don't want your ginger hairs contaminating my evidence. Hamish touched the peak of his cap in a mock salute. Aye, sir. He'll just be mooching about then. He retreated back into the mist, lugs at his heels. Blair was already shouting into his mobile phone, claiming a major breakthrough to his superiors in Strathbane. Hamish didn't look back. He knew Geordie Macnab didn't kill Vane. Geordie was many thinks a drinker, a shouter, and a man who could bend a crowbar with his bare hands, but he was also a man who feared the sight of blood and had a pathological horror of getting his Sunday clothes dirty. To wrestle a man into a tub of clay would have required a mess that Geordie's vanity wouldn't allow. "Come on, lugs," Hamish whispered as they reached the Land Rover. "Let's go see the purse mistress. I have a feeling, missus." Kennedy knows more about Julian Vane's wellness than Blair will ever find in a forensic bag. As he drove away, Hamish looked in the rearview mirror. The yellow Ferrari sat like a silent, expensive witness, its sleek lines already being dulled by the relentless Highland rain. The city police had the body, but Hamish had the village. And in Lochdubh, the village always knew where the bodies were buried and why. Chapter 4. A bitter brew in Lochdubh, while the sirens of Strathbane were still echoing through the glens. Hamish Macbeth was engaged in a much more delicate form of police work. He was leaning against the counter of the Lochdubh post office, his expression one of profound, almost spiritual vacancy. To the casual observer, he looked like a man who might struggle to remember his own middle name, let alone solve a murder. "It's a terrible business, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish sighed, watching the postmistress as she expertly sorted a stack of envelopes. A man coming all this way just to end up as a bit of pottery, and him so full of plans for the village. Mrs. Kennedy, a woman whose spectacles were perched so far down her nose they seemed to be held up by sheer willpower, snorted. She reached under the counter and produced a tin of shortbread. She knew Hamish habits well. A well-fed Hamish was a Hamish who stayed long enough to provide the real news. Plans? He had plans to turn us all into servants, Hamish Macbeth. And don't you pretend otherwise, she said, thrusting the tin toward him. "Taking one of those, are you? You look like you haven't eaten since the coronation." "Just the one, then," Hamish said, taking 3. And did these plans of his involve a lot of heavy mail? He seemed the type to be forever ordering things. Mrs. Kennedy leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that could have been heard in the next county. He wasn't just ordering fancy taps and silk cushions. He was receiving letters from a firm of solicitors in London, very grand ones, the kind with 3 names and no personality. And then there were the maps. Maps? Hamish's ears pricked up, though his face remained as blank as a fresh sheet of parchment. Old ones. Hand-drawn. Had come in here demanding to know if the archives in Inverness were open on Saturdays. He was obsessed with the Macrae family. Not the current ones, Lord knows they are nothing to write home about, but the old Colonel Macrae, the one who built the place in 1880. Hamish chewed slowly, the buttery shortbread melting on his tongue. The Colonel. He was the one who went to India, wasn't he? Came back with a chest of gold and a very bad temper. And a secret, if the stories are true, Mrs. Kennedy added. Vane wasn't just renovating that house, Hamish. He was digging. I saw him myself out there with a spade at 2 a.m. when I was coming back from my sister's. He wasn't planting petunias, I'll tell you that much. Hamish nodded vaguely. Digging. Aye, that would explain the mud under his fingernails. It wasn't just the volcanic clay, then. He bid Mrs. Kennedy a lingering farewell and wandered down the street toward the Spice of Lochdubh, the village's solitary curry shop. Mr. Patel was standing in the doorway, polishing a brass tray. He looked relieved to see Hamish and significantly less relieved at the prospect of DCI Blair's inevitable visit. Mr. Macbeth. A tragedy. A man of business gone, Mr. Patel exclaimed. And the police from the city, they are already asking about my delivery driver. Ah, as if a man who can barely find the Highland Hotel could find his way into a locked conservatory. Now, Mr. Patel, Hamish said soothingly. Blair has a mind like a blunt axe ahead, just swings at whatever's closest. Tell me, did Mr. Vane ever order the extra hot vindaloo? Never. He said it was uncivilized, but he did come in here last Tuesday with a guest. A woman. Very sharp, very posh. Not a local. They were arguing about the inheritance. He told her if she didn't leave him alone, she'd never see a penny of the Victorian legacy. Hamish leaned against the doorframe, his mind whirring behind his sleepy eyes. A Victorian legacy, a digging obsession, and a mysterious woman who wasn't a local. Blair was currently busy trying to pin the crime on Geordie MC Nab because Geordie had a loud voice and a dirty shirt, but the truth of the matter was clearly buried much deeper than a plumbing dispute. Did she have a name, this lady? Hamish asked. He called her Victoria, ironically enough, Mr. Patel said. But she called him a thieving Sassenach bastard, which I thought was a bit rich, considering she sounded like she'd swallowed a silver spoon herself. Hamish thanked him and started the walk back toward his station. He needed to think. He needed more coffee. And most importantly, he needed to find out why a man would travel all the way to the edge of the world to dig for secrets in a bathtub full of mud. As he turned the corner, he saw a sleek silver Jaguar parked near the village pier. Standing beside it was a woman in a perfectly tailored tweed coat, staring out at the loch with an expression of icy calculation. Well, Lugs, Hamish whispered to the dog, who had rejoined him. I believe that's the Victorian secret right there. Ah, and she doesn't look like she's here for the scenery. Chapter 5. The Lady of the Loch, the Silver Jaguar, sat by the pier like a shark in a salmon pond. Hamish Macbeth approached it with his hands deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against a sudden biting wind that whipped off the loch. Lugs trotted beside him, his tail low, sensing the icy atmosphere radiating from the woman standing by the water's edge. She was strikingly beautiful in a way that felt engineered rather than bone-sharp cheekbones, eyes the colour of a winter sky, and hair so perfectly blonde it looked like spun glass. She didn't turn as Hamish approached, her gaze fixed on the grey expanse of Lochdubh. It's a fine view, is it no? Hamish said, his voice a soft, non-threatening murmur. Though the water's a bit restless today. Just like the folk in the village, the woman turned slowly. She looked at Hamish's worn uniform, his scruffy dog, and his uncombed red hair with a look of profound boredom. I assume you are the local constabulary. The one they say spends more time poaching than policing. Hamish gave a small, sheepish grin. Rumours are like the mist, mistress. They get everywhere, and usually hide the truth. Yowl be the lady Mr. Patel saw? Victoria? Victoria Vane, she said, her voice like the snap of a dry twig. Julian's sister. Or, as of 6 o'clock this morning, his sole heir. I suppose I should thank the Highlands for doing what the London courts couldn't, getting him out of my hair. Hamish felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the wind. You're not exactly grieving, Miss Vane. Most folk would be at the hotel with a handkerchief, not standing by the pier staring at the fish. Oh, Julianne was a greedy, short-sighted fool, she replied, pulling a silver cigarette case from her pocket. She struggled to light it in the wind, and Hamish stepped forward, shielding the flame of his lighter with his large, calloused hands. She didn't thank him. but she did take a long drag, her eyes narrowing. He thought he could find the Macrae treasure. He spent 3 years and half our father's estate chasing a Victorian ghost story. The Colonel's gold? Hamish asked. Most folk here think that's just a tale for the tourists. Julian didn't. He found a diary in a London attic. He was convinced the Colonel didn't bring gold back from India, but something far more portable and far more valuable. He bought that wretched house because the map showed it was hidden in the foundations or under them. Before Hamish could press further, the sound of a familiar Land Rover announced the arrival of Priscilla Halberton-Smythe, the daughter of the local colonel and the perennial object of Hamish's frustrated affections. Priscilla stepped out of her car looking, as always, like a portrait of Highland grace. "Hamish," she called out, her brow furrowed. "I heard the news at the hotel. It's dreadful." She stopped short when she saw Victoria. "Ah, Victoria? I didn't realize you were in Lochdubh." The two women exchanged a look that was polite on the surface but contained enough subtext to fill a library. "Priscilla," Victoria nodded. "We went to the same finishing school, Constable. Though Priscilla always had more of a taste for the rugged life than I did." Her eyes flickered dismissively toward Hamish. "I came as soon as I heard," Priscilla said, walking over to join them. She turned to Hamish, her voice softening. "Hamish, you shouldn't be bothering Victoria." "Oh, she's had a shock." "I was just asking about the house, Priscilla," Hamish said mildly, though his mind was racing. Priscilla knew Victoria. That meant Victoria wasn't just a random visitor, she was part of the social circle that Julian Vane had been trying so hard to impress. It seems Julian was looking for something. Priscilla sighed, a small, weary sound. "Everyone knows the Macrae house is a money pit, Hamish. My father warned Julian. He told him the foundations were unstable. There's a network of old Victorian drainage tunnels under that conservatory. If he was digging, well, he was literally undermining his own home." Victoria gave a short, harsh laugh. "Undermining. How poetic. He was always good at that." She flicked her cigarette butt into the loch. "If y'all excuse me, I have a hotel room to secure. I imagine Julian's suite is now available." She marched back to the Jaguar and drove off with a spray of gravel. Hamish watched her go, then looked at Priscilla. "You didn't mention you knew her, Priscilla. I haven't seen her in years, Hamish. She's difficult. The Vanes have always been a volatile family. Julian was obsessed with money, and Victoria's obsessed with status. It's a toxic mix." She looked at him closely. "Blair is already at the station, you know. He's telling everyone he's found the murderer's footprints in the mud." "Footprints, is it?" Hamish rubbed his chin. "And did he mention if the footprints were wearing expensive Italian loafers or wellies borrowed from a local shed?" Priscilla smiled, but her eyes remained worried. "He's arrested Geordie MC Nab, Hamish. Geordie's wife is in hysterics at the hotel. You have to do something." Hamish looked out at the loch. The Victorian legacy wasn't just a story, it was a motive. And Victoria Vane wasn't a grieving sister. She was a woman who had just won a very expensive game of hide-and-seek. "I'll do what I can, Priscilla," Hamish said. "But first I think I'll go and have a word with the minister. He knows more about the old drainage tunnels than anyone. And I have a feeling the mud Blair found isn't the only thing Julian Vane was buried in." Chapter 6. The wrong man's boots, the Lochdubh police station, usually a place of quiet contemplation and the occasional dispute over a wandering sheep, was currently vibrating with the force of DCI Blair's ego. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, industrial-strength floor cleaner, and Blair's sheer, unadulterated triumph. "It's an open and shut case, Anderson," Blair shouted, slamming a plastic evidence bag onto the scarred wooden table. Inside the bag sat a pair of enormous, mud-caked work boots. Found them in the mudroom at the Macrae place. Size 12. Heavy tread. Matches the prints leading from the conservatory to the back gate perfectly. In the small holding cell at the back of the station, Geordie MC Nab let out a roar that sounded like a wounded bull. "I told ye fat Sassenach puppet, those are no my boots. I leave my boots on my own porch, like a civilized man. I was home all night with the flu and a bottle of Talisker. Likely story," Blair yelled back, leaning against the cell bars. "The bottle of whiskey, I believe. The flu? That's just the name you give your hangovers. You went up there, you had a row with Vane about the bill, and you shoved his head into his own fancy mud. Admit it, McNab, and I might tell the fiscal you were provoked by his accent." Hamish Macbeth sat in the corner, his chair tilted back against the wall, cradling a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. He looked like he was drifting off to sleep, his eyes half closed and his expression one of mild, pleasant vacancy. Lugs lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every one of Blair's bellows. "Excuse me, sir," Hamish said softly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blunt knife through butter. Blair spun around, his face deepening to a shade of plum. What is it, Macbeth? Can't you see I'm conducting a high-level interrogation? Go out and see if there's a cat stuck in a tree or something. It's just about the boots, sir, Hamish said, rising slowly to his feet. He ambled over to the table and peered at the evidence bag with the intensity of a man looking at a particularly uninteresting cloud. Thea size 12, right enough. And Geordie here has feet like canal boats, so that fits. Of course it fits, Blair snapped. But, Hamish continued, scratching his red hair, there's a funny thing about Geordie's feet. You see, Geordie was a champion hammer thrower in the Highland Games back in '94. He took a nasty tumble and broke his right ankle in 3 places. Ever since then, he walks with a very heavy lean to the outside of his right foot. Hamish pointed a long, calloused finger at the soles of the boots in the bag. These boots here, Thea worn down right in the centre of the heel, perfectly even. If Geordie had worn these for even a week, the right one would be slanted like a roof tile. He couldn't walk 10 yards in these without his ankle giving way. Blair went silent for a moment, his eyes darting to the boots. He grunted, a sound of pure irritation. He could have bought new ones. He could have borrowed them to throw us off. Geordie McNabb borrowing boots? Hamish gave a short, dry laugh. The man's so vain about his footwear he has them specially reinforced by a cobbler in Dingwall. He wouldn't put his feet in a pair of off-the-shelf stogie boots if his life depended on it. And besides, Hamish leaned in closer, there's no dog hair. Dog hair? Blair looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. What are you havering about now? Geordie's dog, Cutulane, Hamish explained patiently. He's a long-haired collie with a shedding problem that would bankrupt a vacuum cleaner company. Everything Geordie owns, his truck, his house, his Sunday suities covered in white hair. If these were Geordie's boots, they'd be more hair than leather by now. These boots are clean, not a single white hair. Blair snatched the evidence bag off the table, his knuckles white. Fine, so he didn't wear these boots. It doesn't mean he didn't do it. He probably wore trainers and threw them in the loch. The prints in the mud were from these boots, sir, Hamish reminded him gently. If the boots don't belong to Geordie, then the man who made the prints isn't in that cell. Geordie MC Nab let out a triumphant cackle from the cage. Hear that, Blair? You've got the wrong man. Now let me out of here before I sue the Strathbane police for every penny of your pension. Blair turned a terrifying shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at Hamish. You think you're so smart, Macbeth? You think you've solved it? Fine. If it's not the local thug, then who is it? And don't give me any of your village intuition rubbish. I don't know yet, sir, Hamish said, already heading for the door. But I think he'll go and have another look at that bathtub. I have a feeling the mud were looking for ISNT on the floor, but in the pipes. As he stepped out into the drizzle, Hamish felt a pang of sympathy for the dead man. Julian Vane had come to the Highlands looking for a secret, and he had found one. But it wasn't gold, and it wasn't wellness. It was the kind of secret that thrived in the dark, damp places under the floorboards, the kind of secret that killed. Come on, Lugs, Hamish whispered. We need to go back to the Mac Ray place. And this time, we're not looking at the footprints. We're looking at the plumbing. Chapter 7. The ghost in the pipes. The Mac Ray cottage felt different without the swarm of forensic technicians and Blair's barking orders. It felt old, heavy, and deeply resentful. The Highland rain continued its rhythmic assault on the roof, a sound like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping, trying to get in. Hamish Macbeth stood in the centre of the conservatory, Lugs at his side, both of them staring at the massive Victorian bathtub. The volcanic clay had begun to dry, cracking into a map of grey canyons. To the Strathbane police, it was a weapon and a grave. To Hamish, it looked like a very expensive mistake. He was digging, Lugs, Hamish whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Mrs. Kennedy said he was out here at 2 a.m. A man like Vane doesn't dig in the mud for exercise. He was looking for the Colonel's Victorian secret. Hamish knelt by the base of the tub. The clawed feet of the porcelain monster were bolted into the marble floor, but Hamish noticed a slight, almost imperceptible misalignment in the grout. He leaned in closer, his nose inches from the floor. He didn't smell expensive clay or the lavender scent Vane favoured. Oh! He smelled something sharp, metallic and ancient, the scent of a stagnant marsh. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy screwdriver head borrowed from Geordie MC Nab's workshop earlier. With a strength that belied his lanky frame, he began to prise at a specific section of the floorboards just behind the tub. Blair looked at the body, Hamish muttered, and he looked at the boots. But he didn't look at the house. He doesn't understand how these old Highland piles are built. They are like icebergs, Lugs. Most of the trouble is underwater. With a groan of protesting wood, a section of the floor popped up. Below it lay not the solid foundation Hamish expected, but a dark, yawning void. A Victorian drainage tunnel, lined with moss-covered brick, slanted down toward the loch. Hamish pulled a small, battered torch from his pocket and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing a ladder of rusted iron rungs leading down. But that wasn't what caught his eye. Resting on the top rung was a small, sodden object. He fished it out with a pair of tweezers. It was a fragment of a photograph, sepia-toned and brittle. It showed a group of men in Victorian hunting gear standing in front of the cottage. One man, presumably the colonel, stood in the centre, but his face had been violently scratched out. Jealousy, Hamish murmured. Or shame. He climbed down the ladder, his boots splashing into 6 inches of freezing, slow-moving water. The tunnel was narrow, smelling of rot and old secrets. As he moved deeper under the house, the light of his torch caught something glittering in the silt. It wasn't gold. It was a modern brass key, shiny and new, with a plastic tag that read, Lochdubh Hotel Room 4. Hamish stood frozen. Our Room 4 was the room Victoria Vane had just claimed. But it was also the room where the hotel's helpful manager, Mr. Main, kept the spare linens and the master keys. Suddenly the motive shifted in Hamish's mind. This wasn't just about a brother and sister fighting over an inheritance. This was about what Julian Vane had found in these tunnels. He hadn't found gold, he had found a ledger, the same one Mrs. Kennedy mentioned. A ledger that didn't belong to the Vanes, but to a family that had lived in Lochdubh for generations. The Victorian secret was a record of a crime committed 100 years ago, a land theft that had made one local family very rich while others starved. If Julian Vane, the arrogant Sassenach, had exposed that secret to turn the house into a wellness retreat, he would have destroyed the social fabric of the entire glen. Hamish realised then that the mud on the boots wasn't from the garden. It was from this tunnel. The killer hadn't walked across the lawn they had come up from below. They had emerged like a ghost through the floor of the conservatory, surprised Vane while he was in his bath, and held him under the clay. It wasn't a stranger, Lugs, Hamish said, his voice echoing in the damp tunnel. It was someone who knew exactly where these tunnels led, someone who wanted to keep the past buried where it belongs. He heard a faint sound from above the soft, distinct click of the conservatory door opening. Hamish switched off his torch. The darkness swallowed him whole. He felt Lugs press against his leg, the dog's hackles rising. Someone was in the house. Someone who didn't want the Victorian secret to leave the tunnels. The hidden motive was no longer about money. It was about preservation. Highlands. A good name was worth more than a Ferrari, and someone in Lochdubh was willing to kill to keep theirs clean. Hamish began to climb back up, his movements silent and predatory. The lazy policeman was gone. In his place was a man who knew the terrain better than any outsider ever could. He wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. He was protecting the village from a truth that might be more destructive than the crime itself. Chapter 8. The bait in the bar. The bar of the Lochdubh Hotel was thick with the scent of peat smoke, wet wool, and the low, urgent hum of village gossip. Following his discovery in the tunnels, Hamish Macbeth didn't rush to DCI Blair with the evidence. To do so would involve a 3-hour lecture on procedure and the likelihood of being forced to drive the forensics van back to Strathbane. Instead, Hamish was currently slumped in a corner booth, looking like a man who had lost his last friend and his favourite pipe. He was staring despondently into a half-empty pint of heavy, his red hair more dishevelled than usual. Lugs lay across his feet, looking equally miserable. "Och, it's a sad day for justice, Mrs. Grant," Hamish sighed as the hotel mistress wiped down the mahogany counter. "To think poor Geordie is sitting in a cell while the real devil is out there, breathing the fresh Highland air." Mrs. Grant paused, her cloth mid-swirl. "You really think Geordie's innocent, Hamish?" Blair seemed very sure about those boots. Blair would be sure the sun was a fried egg if you served it to him on toast. Hamish muttered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "The boots are a distraction. The real secret is in the Mac Ray Hauser, rather, what's left of it. I found the Colonel's ledger, you see." The bar went momentarily silent. A clink of glasses stopped. Hamish didn't look up, but he felt the sudden sharp tension in the room. He knew that in a village like Lochdubh, a ledger was more dangerous than a loaded shotgun. "A ledger, Hamish?" came a voice from the far end of the bar. It was Mr. Main, the hotel manager. He was a small, fussy man with a moustache that looked like a terrified caterpillar clinging to his upper lip. He was currently polishing a glass with such intensity he looked likely to snap it. What kind of ledger? "The sort that keeps records of who paid what to whom back in the 1880s, Hamish said, his voice trailing off into a yawn. "It seems the Colonel didn't just bring back gold, he brought back a list of names. Folk who helped him..." Well, rearrange the land boundaries. It makes for very interesting reading. It would turn some of our most respected families into common thieves overnight. And where is this ledger now? Mr. Main asked, his voice a fraction too high. Och, it's far too heavy and damp to carry around, Hamish said, leaning back and closing his eyes. I've left it tucked safely in the mouth of that old Victorian drainage tunnel under the conservatory. It's dry enough there for a night. I'll go and fetch it tomorrow morning when the light's better and take it straight to the lawyers in Inverness. I am too tired to play historian tonight. Inverness? Mrs. Grant whispered. That'll cause a stir. Aye, Hamish agreed. A fair old stir, but justice must be served, even if it's 100 years late. Now, I think he'll have a wee bit of that stew before I head back to the station. My stomach's been growling like a disturbed badger all afternoon. Hamish spent the next hour eating slowly, playing the part of the exhausted, dim-witted policeman to perfection. He complained about the damp, he shared a joke with the postman, and he deliberately dropped a hint that he'd be sleeping late the next morning. By 10 o'clock, the bar began to thin out. Hamish tipped his cap to the remaining patrons and whistled for lugs. As he stepped out into the night, the Highland air was cold and sharp, the stars obscured by a heavy blanket of cloud. The bait is on the hook, lugs, Hamish whispered as they reached the Land Rover. Now we just have to see who's hungry enough to bite. He didn't drive to the police station. Instead, he drove half a mile down the road, tucked the Land Rover into a hidden track behind a stand of Scots pines, and began the long, silent trek back toward the Macrae cottage on foot. He didn't use a torch. He knew every dip and stone of the path. He moved with the quiet grace of a poacher, his long legs eating up the distance. By the time he reached the crag, the Highland sanctuary loomed out of the dark like a jagged tooth. He didn't enter through the front door. He circled around to the back, to the hidden entrance of the drainage tunnels he had discovered earlier. He settled himself into a thicket of gorse, wrapping his old tweed coat tightly around him. Luggs sat beside him, a silent shadow. The wait was long. The rain started again, a cold, persistent drizzle that found its way down Hamish's collar. His knees began to ache, and he found himself thinking longingly of his warm stove and a fresh pot of coffee. But he remained motionless. An hour passed, then two. Then the faint metallic clink of a key in a lock. A figure emerged from the shadows of the house, carrying a heavy-duty flashlight. Arrogant Victoria Vane, nor was it a hired thug from the city. The light illuminated a pair of sensible, polished shoes, the kind a man might wear when he wanted to look professional even while committing a crime. The figure moved toward the conservatory, then hesitated, looking toward the tunnel entrance. As the light swept across the ground, Hamish saw the face of the killer. It was a face that had been helpful all week, a face that had expressed nothing but concern for the village. It was Mr. Main, the hotel manager. He wasn't looking for gold. He was looking for the ledger that could strip his family of the land they had held, through deceit, for 3 generations. Och, Mr. Main, Hamish whispered to himself, his hand closing around his heavy police torch. I told you it was a sacred time, T. You should have stayed at the hotel and finished yours. Chapter 9, The Confrontation in the Clay. The conservatory was a cage of glass and shadows, illuminated only by the erratic, nervous beam of Mr. Main's flashlight. From his vantage point behind a heavy velvet curtain, Hamish Macbeth watched as the hotel manager, usually a man of fastidious tidiness, dropped to his knees in the grit. Main was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, his hands trembling as he clawed at the loose floorboards Hamish had pried up earlier. It's no there, Mr. Main, Hamish said, his voice flat and calm, echoing strangely against the glass panes. The flashlight beam jerked upward, bathing Hamish in a harsh, blinding circle of white light. Mr. Main scrambled backward, his heel catching on the rim of the Victorian bathtub. He let out a strangled yelp, his face appearing in the backglow like a pale, panicked moon. Macbeth, Main hissed, his voice cracking. You nearly gave me a heart attack. What are you doing skulking in the dark? I could ask the same of you, Hamish said, stepping out from the shadows. He didn't have his torch on, he didn't need it. He knew the room by the feel of the air. But then, I already know the answer. You're looking for the Colonel's ledger, the one that proves your great-grandfather didn't buy the mainland's farm, but stole it from the crofters while the Colonel looked the other way. Main straightened up, trying to regain some semblance of his usual stiff-necked dignity, though it was difficult while covered in plaster dust and cobwebs. That's a lie. A Highland fairy tale. My family has been respected in this village for a century. Respect is a fragile thing, Mr. Main. It's like that volcanic clay in the tub looks solid enough until you add a bit of water, and then it just turns to muck. Hamish took a slow step forward. Luggs stood at his side, a low rumbling growl vibrating in the dog's chest. Julian Vane found that ledger when he started digging for his wellness retreat. He realized he could bankrupt half the respectable families in Lochdubh by revealing the truth of the land titles. He tried to blackmail you, didn't he? Maine's eyes darted toward the open window, then back to Hamish. He was a parasite. He was going to destroy everything. My father, my grandfather, they worked that land. Vane didn't care about history. He just wanted a boutique story to tell his London friends. So you came up through the tunnels, Hamish said. You knew the layout from the old maps in the hotel archives. You surprised him while he was in that tub. A man in a bath is a very vulnerable thing, Mr. Maine, especially when the water weighs as much as lead. Maine's face contorted. A helpful manager vanished, replaced by a man possessed by a desperate ancestral rage. He deserved it. He laughed at me. He sat there in that ridiculous mud and told me I'd be his head waiter by Christmas once he owned the deeds. Suddenly, Maine's hand dived into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out a ledger, he pulled out a heavy, brass-handled fireplace poker head snatched from the hotel lobby. He lunged at Hamish with a speed born of pure cornered-animal panic. For a man who spent most of his life leaning against walls, Hamish Macbeth moved with the fluid, startling grace of a hunting cat. He didn't retreat. He stepped into the blow, catching Maine's wrist with a hand that felt like a steel trap. The poker clattered to the marble floor with a ringing chime. With a sharp twist, Hamish sent the smaller man spinning toward the bathtub. Maine hit the porcelain rim and tumbled backward, landing with a sickening squelch directly into the half-dry, viscous grey clay. He struggled to rise, but the volcanic mud, designed to cling and heavy with its own weight, acted like quicksand. The more he thrashed, the deeper he sank into the grey mire. "Don't struggle, man," Hamish said, picking up the poker and leaning on it like a walking stick. "You'll only tire yourself out, and I'd hate for you to drown in your own evidence before the fiscal gets a look at you."
You stupid red-headed peat cutter!
Maine spat, his moustache now caked in grey silt. "Blair will never believe you." "There's no proof." There's plenty of proof," Hamish said mildly. "There's the key to room 4 I found in the tunnel, the one you dropped when you were fleeing. And then there's the fact that you're currently sitting in a bathtub full of murder weapon." Hamish pulled his radio from his belt. "Lochdubh to base. Come in, Anderson." I've got him. He's in the tub. You might want to bring a few towels and a very large pair of handcuffs." As the distant sound of sirens began to wail through the glen, Hamish sat on the edge of the tub, ignoring the frantic curses of the man stuck in the mud. He looked out through the glass at the dark, silent mountains. The secret was out, but the village would remain. The Highlands had a way of absorbing even the messiest of truths, eventually turning them back into the quiet, peat-stained earth. "Well, lugs," Hamish sighed, patting the dog's head. "That's the paperwork started. I suppose I can kiss my breakfast goodbye." Chapter 10. The unwanted hero the dawn was beginning to bleed a pale, sickly yellow into the grey Highland sky by the time the last of the police vehicles prepared to depart the Macrae cottage. DCI Blair stood on the gravel driveway, his chest puffed out so far he looked like a pigeon in a cheap suit. He was currently being interviewed by a shivering reporter from the Strathbane Gazette who had been tipped off about the spectacular capture of the Lochdubh killer. It was a matter of classic police intuition, Blair boomed, his voice carrying over the wind. "I noticed the discrepancies in the plumbing early on. I knew the suspect would return to the scene to retrieve the evidence, and I positioned my men, including, of course, the local constable, to intercept him. A messy business, catching a man in a bathtub, but the Strathbane CID is always prepared to get its hands dirty." Hamish Macbeth stood 20 yards away, leaning against his Land Rover with a look of such profound, vacant exhaustion that the reporter hadn't even bothered to ask him for a quote. He was nursing a lukewarm cup of thermos coffee, watching Luggs sniff at a discarded evidence bag. D.S. Anderson wandered over, looking at Hamish with a mixture of pity and grudging respect. "You're letting him take it again, aren't you, Hamish? You did all the legwork, found the tunnels, and practically gift-trapped Maine in a layer of volcanic silt. Why let that blowhard take the glory?" Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee and looked up at the mountains, his eyes hooded. "If I take the credit, Anderson, the chief constable in Inverness will start talking. Hell talk about potential and career advancement. Hell want to move me to a desk in a city where the air smells of bus exhaust and the people don't know their neighbours' names. I like my desk right where it is, looking out at the loch. But Maine will tell the truth in court," Anderson pointed out. "Hell say it was you who caught him. By the time Blair finishes writing the official report, Hell have convinced himself he was the one who wrestled the poker away. Hamish replied with a dry smile.
And Maine is a broken man.
Hell be too busy trying to keep his family's land titles from being investigated to worry about which policeman put the cuffs on him. And the ledger, Anderson lowered his voice. The Victorian secret that started all this. I didn't see it in the evidence logs. Hamish looked at the dark, churning waters of the loch. The tunnels flooded, Anderson. The rain was heavy last night, and that old Victorian brickwork isn't to what it used to be. Anything left in those drains is likely halfway to the Atlantic by now, turned back into pulp and ink. It was a lie, of course. The ledger was currently tucked under the spare tyre of the Land Rover, destined for a very private meeting with a very small fire in Hamish's hearth. He knew that if the crimes of the 1880s were brought to light, it wouldn't bring the dead back to life. It would only ruin the lives of the innocent descendants who had done nothing wrong but inherit a name. In Lochdubh, sometimes the best kind of justice was the kind that let the past sleep. Priscilla Halberton Smythe drove up as the forensic van was pulling out. She stepped out of her car, her eyes searching for Hamish. When she found him, she walked over, her expression softening. I heard, Hamish. Mr. Maynaye, it's hard to believe. He always seems so helpful at the hotel. The most dangerous people usually do, Priscilla, Hamish said, tipping his cap. They are the ones who have the most to hide, and Blair is telling everyone he masterminded the whole thing, she said, her lip curling in a slight sneer.
Are you really going to let him get away with it?
It's a small price to pay for peace and quiet, Priscilla. Would you like to come back to the station? I was thinking of putting a pot of stew on. It's been a long night. Priscilla looked at him, the tall, lanky man who chose to be a failure so he could remain a part of the land he loved. She smiled, a genuine warm look that made Hamish's heart do a small, hopeful somersault. I'd like that, Hamish. But only if Lugs gets a bowl too. An hour later, the Lochdubh police station was filled with the savoury, rich scent of mutton stew and onions. The fire was crackling in the stove, and the Victorian secret damp, mouldy ledger of Colonel Mac Riawaz slowly curling into black ash amidst the peat. Hamish sat in his armchair, his feet up, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand. Lugs was already snoring by the hearth, his belly full of scraps. Outside, the Highland rain continued to fall, but inside, the peace of the village had been restored. DCI Blair would get a commendation. Geordie MacNab would et an apology, which he would leverage into free drinks at the bar for a month. And Hamish Macbeth? Hamish Macbeth got to stay exactly where he wanted to be. He looked out the window at the mist rolling over the hills. There would be more trouble. Eventually. There would be more greedy outsiders and more local grudges. But for today, the larder was full, the fire was warm. And the only thing Hamish had to worry about was whether he should go back to the river and see if that salmon was still waiting. He closed his eyes, a small, sceptical smile playing on his lips. Aye, Lugs, he whispered into the quiet room. It's a terrible thing being a failure, but it's a grand way to live. Chapter 11. The bitter aftertaste of victory, the arrest of a pillar of the community is, in a village like Lochdubh, a social earthquake of the highest magnitude. By the next afternoon, the news that Mr. Mindman, who had meticulously organised every Rotary Club luncheon and hotel gala, for 20 years was currently occupying a cell in Strathbane, had travelled faster than a gale-force wind through the glens. The Lochdubh Hotel was in a state of polite anarchy. Mrs. Grant had taken over the keys, but without Mr. Maine's obsessive attention to the linen counts and the silver polish, the grand old building seemed to be sighing with relief. In the bar, the regulars spoke in hushed, reverent tones, not about the murder, but about the scandal of the land titles. Hamish Macbeth sat on a bench outside the police station, the rare Highland sun warming his face. He was ostensibly on patrol, which in Hamish lexicon meant keeping a sharp eye on the horizon to ensure no one from headquarters was approaching. Lugs lay at his feet, snapping lazily at a passing horsefly. The peace was shattered by the sharp, aggressive crunch of tyres on gravel. The silver Jaguar screeched to a halt, and Victoria Vane stepped out. She was dressed for travel, wearing a camel-hair coat that looked like it belonged on Bond Street, not a Highland pier. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "Constable," she said, her voice dripping with ice. Hamish didn't move, other than to crack one eye open. "Aye, Miss Vane. Heading south, are you? It's a fine day for the drive. The A9 is relatively clear of sheep this time of day. Don't play the fool with me, Macbeth," she snapped, stepping closer. The scent of her expensive perfume fought a losing battle against the smell of wet gorse and peat. "I've been to the house. The drainage tunnels are flooded. The builders tell me the foundations are compromised beyond repair, and the local solicitor tells me there are complications regarding the deed. Och, Is that so? Hamish asked, looking remarkably surprised. Foundations can be tricky things in the Highlands. All that peat, you see. It moves when you least expect it. You found that ledger, didn't you? She leaned in, her blue eyes sharp and accusing. Julian wasn't just digging for gold. He was a greedy man, but he was meticulous. He told me Head found proof that would make the Highland elite crawl to him. Now he's dead, the manager is in jail, and the proof has mysteriously vanished into the mud. Hamish stood up slowly, stretching his long limbs. He towered over her, his expression one of mild bovine curiosity. It's a terrible thing, the damp. It ruins paper faster than anything. If there was a ledger, Miss Vane, it's likely part of the Lochdubh by now. The Highlands have a way of reclaiming what belongs to them. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. For the first time the mask of boredom slipped, and a flicker of genuine realization crossed her face. She looked at the scruffy policeman with his uncombed hair and his lazy Highland drawl, and she saw the man who had stood in the dark with a poker. She saw the man who had decided, all on his own, what truths the village was allowed to keep. "Oh, you're a very dangerous man, Constable," she whispered. "Because you look like someone who couldn't find his own shoes, yet you've managed to bury a century of secrets in a single night." "I'm just a simple policeman, Miss Vane," Hamish said, his voice soft and steady. "I just like things to be quiet. And I imagine y'all find London much more to your liking. There are fewer tunnels there, and the secrets are much more modern." She didn't reply. She turned on her heel, got back into the Jaguar, and accelerated out of Lochdubh with a roar of the engine that sounded like a scream of frustration. Hamish watched the car disappear around the bend. He felt a slight weight in his pocket, small, sepia-toned fragment of the photograph Head rescued from the tunnel. Head kept it, not as evidence, but as a reminder. "She's right about one thing, Lugs," Hamish murmured, sitting back down on the bench. "The foundations are compromised, but it's no just the house." He was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Halberton Smythe, Priscilla's father. The colonel was a man who looked like he had been carved out of a particularly stubborn piece of oak, usually dressed in loud tweeds and an even louder sense of entitlement. Today, however, he looked uncharacteristically subdued. "Macbeth," the colonel grunted, stopping in front of the bench. "Colonel," Hamish replied. "Nasty business at the hotel. Maine always thought he was a bit too fond of his own importance. Shame about the house, too. Vane was a nuisance, but he had money." The colonel cleared his throat, his eyes fixed firmly on a point somewhere above Hamish's head. "Priscilla tells me you were instrumental in the clean-up." "I just did what was required, Colonel. Blair did the heavy lifting." "Quite." The colonel shifted his weight. "There's talk in the village, Macbeth. Talk of old records, ledgers and such. I don't suppose you encountered anything of the sort?" Hamish looked the colonel straight in the eye. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of things unsaid. The colonel knew. His family had been here as long as the Mains. He knew exactly what kind of ghosts lived in the Victorian drainage tunnels. "The tunnels are flooded, Colonel," Hamish said firmly. "Anything in them is gone. The water's very deep, and the mud is very thick. It's best no to go looking for things that want to stay lost." The colonel let out a long, slow breath. His shoulders seemed to drop an inch. "I see. Yes. Wise, very wise, Macbeth. Perhaps Yow'll come up to the house for a drink this evening. Priscilla mentioned she'd like to thank you properly. I might just do that, Colonel, if the sheep behave themselves." The colonel nodded and marched off, his step significantly lighter. Hamish watched him go, a dry, sceptical smile touching his lips. He had saved the respectable families of Lochdubh, but he had no illusions about them. They were grateful now, but gratitude in the Highlands was like the summer sunwarm while it lasted, but gone the moment the wind changed. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, rising for the final time. "The sun's going down and I have a date with a very important piece of history. And then, I think I'll have a bowl of that stew." Chapter 12. The smoke in the hearth the evening had settled over Lochdubh like a thick woolen blanket, muffling the sounds of the village and turning the waters of the loch into a sheet of black glass. Inside the police station, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of burning peat and the savoury, lingering aroma of mutton stew. Hamish Macbeth sat in his favourite armchair sagging, velvet-covered relic that had seen better decayed sand watch the flames dancing behind the glass door of his iron stove. On his lap sat the ledger. Its leather cover was warped by a century of damp, and the pages were swollen with the brackish water of the drainage tunnels. It was a heavy, ugly thing, filled with the cramped, precise handwriting of a man who had valued property over people. Julian Vane had seen it as a gold mine, Mr. Maine had seen it as a death warrant. Hamish saw it for what it truly was, a poison that had already claimed one life and was quite capable of destroying a dozen more. He flipped open a page near the middle. There, in faded ink, was a list of names that still appeared on the shop fronts and mailboxes of Lochdubh today. There were records of donations made to the colonel in exchange for clarifications of boundary lines. It was a map of old greed, a legacy of theft that had laid the foundations for the village's current social hierarchy. "The truth shall set ye free, Lugs," Hamish murmured, stroking the dog's head as Lugs rested his chin on the constable's knee. "But in a place like this, the truth is more likely to set the neighbours' barns on fire." With a slow, deliberate movement, Hamish tore the first page from the book. He opened the stove door, the orange glow illuminating the sharp lines of his face and the weary wisdom in his eyes. He fed the paper to the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished in a puff of grey smoke. Page by page, the Victorian secret began to disappear. Oh, he thought of Julian Vane, with his yellow car and his white linen suit, who had come to the Highlands to build a sanctuary on a foundation of blackmail. Vane hadn't understood that the people of Lochdubh were like the heatherthy looked soft from a distance. But they were tough, wiry, and deeply rooted in the soil. You couldn't just transplant a city ego into the peat and expect it to thrive. The telephone on the desk gave a sharp, imperious ring. Hamish didn't move. He waited until he had fed the last of the ledger's spine into the fire before he finally rose and answered it. "Macbeth here," he said, his voice dropping into its most vacant, slow-witted tone. "Macbeth, is that you? Why the devil did it take you so long to answer?" It was the unmistakable, self-important bellow of DCI Blair. Even over the phone, the man sounded like he was trying to win an argument with a foghorn. "Och, I was just checking the locks, sir," Hamish havered. "It's a misty night, and you know how the sheep can get restless. Never mind the sheep, man. Have you seen the late edition of the Gazette? Front page. Blair's bathtub bust. They've got a photo of me holding the poker. The chief constable himself called to offer his congratulations. There's even talk of a commendation for the team." "That's grand news, sir," Hamish said, a small secret smile touching his lips. "Truly grand. You'll be heading for that promotion in Strathbane soon, I imagine? Or maybe even Glasgow? Don't be ridiculous, Macbeth. Someone has to keep an eye on these northern outposts. Though I must say, the Commissioner was very impressed with my report on how I directed you to secure the perimeter. He said it showed excellent leadership in a rural crisis." "Aye, sir. Oh, you're a leader of men." "Right enough," Hamish agreed, his voice a masterpiece of feigned sincerity. "I'm just glad I could be of minimal assistance, as long as you know your place, Macbeth. Now, see to it that the station is clean. I might be stopping by next week for a formal inspection. I want to have the Strathbane hero visiting a pigsty." Blair slammed the phone down. Hamish replaced the receiver gently, the silence of the room returning like a long-lost friend. He was safe. Blair had the glory, the papers had their hero, and Hamish Macbeth had his peace. He wouldn't be promoted, he wouldn't be transferred, and he wouldn't have to wear a suit to work. He returned to his chair and picked up his mug of coffee. It was thick, black, and exactly how he liked it. Outside, the rain had returned, a gentle drumming on the roof that spoke of long, quiet nights and the predictable rhythm of village life. Geordie MC Nab was back in his workshop, Victoria Vane was back in London, and the secrets of the Macrae house were now nothing more than ash in his grate. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The wellness Julian Vane had promised had finally come to Lochdubh, though not in the way the Sassenach had intended. It was the wellness of a secret kept, a tragedy averted, and a village allowed to remain exactly as it was, stubborn, beautiful, and deeply, comfortably flawed. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered, the dog giving a sleepy, contented sigh. "I think that's enough work for 1 year. Tomorrow, I think we'll go and see about that salmon. The river should be running high after all this rain." The fire flickered one last time and then settled into a steady, warm glow. In the heart of the Highlands, the lazy policeman of Lochdubh was finally at rest.